the great illness that plagues our modern culture, which is precisely that we have forgotten how to rest. The only audience that you really own is the emails on your email list. Ideas was my strong suit. I wasn't going to get any followers shaking my ass. We're all raised in modern culture to believe that there's something wrong with us. Our current position as a society is really quite damning. We're way more effective relying on this restful wisdom than we ever are in anxiety, which is our typical state that we're conditioned into by society. It was difficult to believe. Sounded too good to be true.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Culmination Project. Today I have a good friend and Twitter homie, Dan Goldfield, who is a mindfulness teacher and somewhat of a prolific writer on Twitter as well. He was there for the very beginning of my journey. Actually, you're one of the first people that I reached out to on Twitter when I knew literally nothing about what I was doing at all. And in my my clumsy toddler like way of finding my way through Twitter, you were very kind to a message I put out. It was great. So that started the relationship nicely.
I don't remember the message, but I do remember the time, brother, and I remember our first call together and how much we had in common and
yeah, man,
so much light to share. It was beautiful.
It's good stuff.
Yeah, really pleased to still have some of these connections from, what are we talking, 18 months ago now?
Yeah,
which is a long time on the digital frontier. You know, that really feels like a long time ago.
Oh, 100%. And so much changes on that, particularly that platform, like even in 30 or 60 days, you know, like with the algo and just kind of, you know, what Elon's doing and everything. Yeah. It's pretty wild. I actually took a break from it for a few months and came back, and it was just kind of a different, you know, similar still obviously, but a different landscape in a lot of ways. So yeah, it is pretty wild. How long have you been on Twitter now, like actively working towards what you're doing now?
Yeah, so I started this account in August 22. I kind of had a lurker account beforehand.
Okay.
Where I would maybe post something akin to a short journal entry every now and then, which no one was interested in, as we would expect. You know, I've learned so much about how to present ideas for the attention marketplace since then. So I started a new account in August 22, and we're now just about February, aren't we? 24. So yeah, we're looking about 18 months, I'd say.
Okay. Maybe before we dive into sort of, you know, your history mindfulness coach, teacher, I kind of want to give us a little bit of a rundown on what prompted you to start seriously writing on Twitter and sort of make that shift towards where you're at now with that.
It was one phone call, actually, with a peer of mine who was also practicing mindfulness pretty seriously. We kind of came up together doing our practice, learning to understand ourselves. I went through a long period of relative silence during one of the extended COVID lockdowns in the UK, where I was really experiencing that truth of how language is inadequate for describing awakening, the process of awakening. The non-dual truth to which all these teachings point, given that, of course, language is dualistic. It's about stuff. So there's the stuff and the speaker. Right. So I was really feeling that conundrum, you know, how do I talk about this stuff in such a way that doesn't misrepresent it?
Right.
Kind of really feeling the emptiness side of all of this in myself. And so was very quiet for that time. But I was having these wonderful conversations with this particular friend of mine on the phone. And we would talk about all kinds of stuff from the perspective that we'd been able to gain through our practice. And he said, Dan, dude, why don't you just start sharing about this stuff online? I said, you know, I never considered it. You know, like so many people who come to this game never really consider that there might be an audience for their thoughts.
Right.
It turns out that this is actually something of a delusion of grandeur. It's just in the opposite direction to where a delusion of grandeur usually goes, right? We associate those kinds of delusions with narcissism. but actually to think, oh, no one's interested in what I have to say.
Right.
That's also kind of a delusion of grandeur. It's a thinking that one is special.
Right.
Because actually the truth is, as you and I both know, having been out here in the attention marketplace for long enough now, everyone's got something interesting to say. And everyone can find an audience just saying whatever it is they might say to their journal. Now, they may have to think about how they package those thoughts if they're going to make sense to someone else. But that's just the skill set, right? That's the easy part. So indeed, there is an audience for everyone. But that's how it started for me, was with that phone call of that friend of mine just saying, hey, why don't you get out online and share some of this stuff, you know? And actually, I started on an app called Insight Timer. That was where I released my first content. They host teachers for guided meditations. Maybe you're familiar, brother.
I am, yeah. I have a subscription. Yeah.
Great.
I'll have to listen to you on there. I haven't listened to any of your stuff.
Yeah. I got like 85 talks and guided meditations out on there. I really hit it quite hard for around a year. The problem that I found in the end with that platform is that it's a closed ecosystem.
Right. You gotta
because
buy in.
They pay teachers. They pay teachers a portion of the subscription, and therefore, quite rightly, it's almost impossible to deplatform your following. So you can't get them over to your newsletter, which is, of course, as you know, the only audience that you really own as a creator is the emails on your email list. So I decided to hop over to what was then Twitter, simply because it remains to be the least superficial of the social media platforms.
Yeah, and the least policed.
And the least policed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's where we've got that most free-flowing stream of ideas. And of course, ideas was my strong suit. I wasn't going to get any followers shaking my ass. Yeah. So, although I've never tried it, who knows?
Yeah. When you don't have that kind of a booty or a Chippendales body, you gotta find other outlets.
Yeah.
And plus, this is something, talking about this stuff will actually go the distance and go long term. Whereas like a body, it gets old, it gets a little sloppy, little droopy over time, no matter how fit you are. So this stuff we could talk about into our 90s.
Indeed. I plan to.
Yeah, 100%. No, I like how you spoke about grandeur in the opposite direction, right? So often we think of grandeur as in like the look at me, right? Or like this sort of adulation or wanting the attention or like always thinking we're right. But there is the grandeur and I'm going to be super humble because nobody wants to hear from me, or I'm afraid. What if I'm too loud or I say too much and people see me as this egoic sort of expression, right? Which is it's the opposite side of the coin, and I think there's definitely a middle ground to be found, particularly if it's authentic to you, right? And just putting it out there, and it's not going to be for everybody. It's not going to hit every person that listens to it, and there's going to be inevitably critics, right? I heard you talking about the other day how somebody it was on either one of your, I think it was on maybe one of your videos or something, but talking about how people give you shit sometimes about there's no way you meditated 29,000 hours, blah blah blah. And it's like, it doesn't mean I'm like sitting in lotus posture for 29,000 hours, right?
Right.
The implication is that eventually your life becomes a meditation, right?
Precisely.
And meditation.
Precisely.
Is just
and actually then, and naysayers around anything that we say actually just give us an opportunity to clarify our position.
Right.
They give us a reason to continue the conversation. Well, hey, meditation actually doesn't have to be done in a meditation hall sitting full lotus.
Right. And meditation is just a word, right? It's any meditation technique. I was just talking to this woman about this the other day who used to be a devotee of Amrita, and she was talking about or we were talking about how like these techniques and these strategies to meditation, whether it's a mantra or it's, concentration or the breath, these are all strategizing ways to get the mind out of the way so that you can actually experience being, right, which is the natural state. So it's really a remove. It's a useful tool for temporary, at least, removal, so that you can integrate that seeing, right, which is so it's not really an addition, even though sometimes
Indeed.
I guess misnomer of it is, or the potential downside to meditation practice, quote unquote, is people can get so focused on the practice that they miss the goal, which is the being piece. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, of how you kind of maybe guide people towards not getting obsessed with the goal of meditation as being the goal versus, the evoking of presence as really the state that we're looking for.
Yeah, very important. I was just thinking of that famous one-liner from the Zen tradition as we were speaking just moments ago, that Zen is a finger pointing at the moon.
Right.
And that the practitioner must be careful to not mistake the finger for the moon. Right? The way that I guide people towards this realization, or attempt to kind of guardrail people away from what's been called spiritual materialism, right? Becoming more concerned with the practice than the being, is I keep the practices that I recommend as lean as possible.
Right.
And I recommend as few as possible. So these days, I actually begin with students, in a way of speaking, at the end. And what I mean by the end is I give them the most profound spiritual instruction I ever came across, which is to rest naturally without seeking or describing anything.
Yeah.
Rest naturally without seeking or describing anything. Most people find that instruction very difficult. The reason being, we've been so trained into doing.
How?
And so,
Right.
indeed. Oh, man. I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. So often I get the question, well, how do I rest?
Yeah.
Resting isn't a doing.
Right. How do I just
there is no
allow
how.
everything?
And I mean,
how do I allow everything to be? Right. Well, it's already being.
Yeah. And so this points to the great illness that plagues our modern culture, which is precisely that we have forgotten how to rest. We have forgotten what rest is.
Right.
We've replaced it with doings in every direction, such that we take rest to be more doing, meaning we go out and party, we play video games, we socialize, we fix up our house, we wash the car, we do chores, right? Anything, any number of things that are not just resting, just doing nothing.
Right.
In fact, most people are lamentably uncomfortable when you just sit them in a room by themselves with nothing to do. Oh, there was an experiment done on this that someone reminded me of recently. And I'll butcher the specifics, but the gist of it was they had a bunch of people sit in a room with nothing going on, except they could press a button to give themselves an electric shock. Almost everyone pressed the button, and the experiment only turned out to be about the amount of time it took. So it wasn't about whether or not they would press the button in the end. It was just how long before these people hurt themselves.
Yeah, they would rather
because they're so uncomfortable.
Right, they would rather feel physical anguish than face or even like be with the neurosis of their mind.
Yeah. What does that tell us about our current position as a society? Right. It's really quite damning. And so what will typically happen, brother, is that I'll see someone and I'll give this recommendation, rest naturally without seeking or describing anything. Now, it's worth noting that most people who find their way to me already have some experience with meditation and mindfulness.
Right.
So we're not beginning from zero. I have had a few conversations with folks who have never encountered any of the teachings before. And it is interesting. Some people will grab it and understand it.
Right.
Most students who come to me will have some degree of comprehension. Then what will occur is they'll say something to the effect of, okay, well, I can manage to rest sat here speaking with you. In fact, it's quite easy in this environment where this is our main concern. But when I go to work, I'm fucked. Right. How do I rest naturally without seeking or describing anything at work? Don't I have to tense up in order to get my work done? Don't I have to seek certain results? Don't I have to seek certain kinds of interactions from my colleagues? Don't I have to describe everything that I'm doing? And so then we'll work together to navigate those situations in which they feel that it's difficult to relax.
Right.
Until slowly they begin to see, oh, I can live my whole life from a condition of relaxation. Not only that, but actually this is my natural condition. This is my default mode. And that actually wisdom will take care of everything that needs to be done, as opposed to what I've been trying to do, which is to rely on forcing myself through things by shoulds and oughts and musts and intellectual knowledge, trying to figure things out, always trying to shape myself into something better. No, actually, when I just relax, there's this natural wisdom that is now unobscured, which knows how to interact with colleagues, how to get things done. And indeed, we're way more effective relying on this restful wisdom than we ever are in anxiety, which is our typical state that we're conditioned into by society.
Right, because I love this point. It's like in Zen, they call it the backward step, right? It's actually taking a step back from trying to solve anything, which allows the answer to come. It's like when I can't think about a word or I can't think of someone's name, right? The harder I try, the less likely it is to come to me, right? But people think, our minds. You hit the nail on the head. Our minds are so conditioned to need to know and to figure it out that there's that,
and that the way to figure it out is effort,
right? And there's a
and more effort and more effort.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So that's why, like you said, it's a continued. It's not even so much, in my experience, a technique. It is a practice, but it's just a continued stepping back and seeing that it doesn't work. The awareness that it doesn't work optimally eventually starts to untangle thought and starts to untangle that drive, and you naturally let go. Right.
Right. So I've really come to enjoy the word recognition.
Yeah.
We're recognizing something that's already the case.
Right.
Recognizing that our fundamental nature is that awareness which is naturally wise and kind and compassionate and beneficial and effective. Right. And so you can hear in this, brother, depending on the degree of understanding that the student demonstrates, I might get away with never prescribing them a deliberate practice at all.
Right.
We might skip meditation entirely. Meditation in the sense of sitting down cross-legged, doing all kinds of techniques to cultivate certain states. The issue with that being, we're interested in states.
Right.
When we're trying to meditate our way into something by means of a technique, it's very wholesome. This is a wonderful thing to do, but all of the wisest teachers that I've come across have prescribed these methods appropriate to each practitioner's degree of understanding. And I have a hypothesis about this, which is that I think in general, our degree of understanding of ourselves has increased greatly. really over the past 20 years or so, I think, as that term mental health has come more and more into the public narrative, people are more introspective, people are more open-minded, people are more broad in their perspectives.
Right.
People are aware of the possibility of improving what's going on in the mind. Now, we're back into the same trap. This will typically lead someone to say, well, what do I do to improve my mind?
Right, exactly.
But from that position, right, we're really not that far away from just having that conversation of saying, well, hey, hold on, let's not make this an additive thing. This is a subtractive thing. We're looking to subtract your anxieties, your dissatisfactions, your tensions. And what remains is this wonderful beneficial nature that's been obscured. And for me, that showed up in my life, first of all, as a hypothesis.
Right.
It was difficult to believe, sounded too good to be true.
Yeah.
Because, of course, we're all raised in modern culture to believe that there's something wrong with us and that we have to fix ourselves.
Right. Original sin.
Right. As children. Original sin, exactly. It goes deep.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Not only are you a problem,
but
you were born a problem. Right?
Right?
Yeah.
Right? And there's nothing you can do about it, and your whole life is about repentance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And God had to
How's
come
that
down
for starting with a handicap?
Right. God had to send his son to essentially be killed in order to, because you're such a terrible person.
Yeah.
In Western culture, that's what it's ingrained. Even if you're not religious, it's ingrained.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? Because in the East, they don't even have like much of a reference point for that.
Yeah, I imagine that might sound crazy to some Eastern folks.
Yeah.
Right. And so we're deeply fortunate now to have the benefit of teachers like Alan Watts and Ram Dass, who did such great work in translating those Eastern teachings into words that the Western mind could approach and begin to grab onto. So those were the two teachers that I started with. Indeed, if I had tried to dive in with some of the teachers that I experienced later, maybe I wouldn't have found any traction, because that Western mind would just have still been too clinging to all of those ideas which are central to our culture. It's always fascinating to me how, when we look back, we see this journey, and it really looks as though there's a personal identity here who's having a development and going through this whole thing. And yet, from what is realized later on, it seems that it really is all an illusion.
Right.
That the bare awareness that is our fundamental nature was simply witnessing all of that as it was occurring. So there was this appearance of a person, Dan, going through this transformation. But all the while, awareness was perfectly lucid and clear, just so much as it is now. There's just less going on that's in the way of that awareness, so to speak. But in the end, it seemed that the awareness is not separate to the phenomena anyway. So it all kind of collapses in on itself. This was the experience that I had, was that subject and object just collapses. And you're left with what always was, which is the awareness that has always been, quote, looking out from behind your eyes, although it of course has no location.
Right.
But we experience that, right? This is an analogy that I use often with people, or an image that I use often with people, is we've all had the experience of staring in the mirror and feeling like, I'm the same me as I've been since I was 6 years old. I remember looking in the mirror when I was 6 and going, oh, I'm a person. There's my face.
Right.
And then at 8 years old, oh, wow, my face has changed.
Right.
And then at 13 years old, oh, there's hair on it now. And then, but we have this sense of being the same behind all of that experience.
Yes, the essence is the same. I feel like it feels like meanness. It's meanness.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And so in the beginning, we have a separation, don't we, between, we feel like everyone knows what awareness is, but the common misconception is, I have an awareness.
Right.
That it's somehow something that is generated by the human form. Well, there's no proof for this.
Right.
The scientists have been looking really hard to try to prove this one. There is not a shred of evidence that awareness is generated by the human form, and this is where it gets trippy, because we're so identified with the body. We so take the body and the self-referential mind to be who and what we are,
Right.
that the idea that awareness may not be generated by the human form, and of course that's not proved either, but what we do know is that the position that awareness is generated by the human form is only a theory, and a very flimsy one at that, because that we just have no evidence for it.
Right.
So when we start to consider, well, hold on a sec, I'm having these experiences, I'm looking at, I feel like there's this sameness, I feel like I have this awareness, but does awareness appear within my body, or does my body appear within awareness?
Yeah, exactly. Do I have awareness, or
starts
does
to get
awareness have me?
right. Shit starts to get trippy real quick.
Yeah,
Real quick. And what's trippy about it is that in contemplation of those kinds of questions, it's like the Zen koan, right? It breaks the conventional mind.
right.
The mind can't answer that question, can't really comprehend, and we're forcing the mind to open up and release and
Right.
let go and eventually dissolve.
Right. Well, and something you said earlier about when you first heard of this, any of this sort of notion, right? That it was more of a reducing or a removal, that you couldn't, it was unbelievable to you, right? Because like there's such an identification with the me who sees it as unbelievable that it's daunting to look at, like, so everything I've ever, all these layers of bullshit that I've been taught by and large mean nothing. Right. And now I have to undo it all and eventually undo who I think I am. Like that's most people. That's why it's so hard for people to sit in a room alone.
Indeed. Though a word of encouragement, though a word of encouragement that I'll give for our listeners is that my experience is that there's something of a full circle to all of this, which is that I'm more able to engage with the world now as a worldly person, as Dan, as just an ordinary dude, than I ever was previously, when I was anxious and worried and dealing with all my own neuroses. So now the apex of that circle was this period of silence, was this journey into emptiness, to see, precisely as you laid out, Cole, that, well, shit, everything I've ever been told is only relatively true.
Right.
It's not true in any absolute sense, right? And to see this, we only need to compare one culture with another, right? One culture's truths are entirely different to the truths of another culture. Maybe there's some overlap, but there are certainly places where cultures differ. And yet all of those cultures prospered under those very different metaphysical beliefs.
Right.
And so that's how we see, okay, these truths are only relatively true, right? Original sin is relatively true. And it got us as far as the Industrial Revolution. And, you know, that's a real mixed bag. But it certainly offered us a lot of convenience. We're able to do what we're doing right here and now, having this conversation and educating people about this stuff, thanks to the Industrial Revolution. So it's this weird duality, right? There's good and bad in everything. The Industrial Revolution did great harm to the world and great harm to many people, you know, kids working in factories and whatnot. At the same time, here we are talking about this stuff and hopefully giving some listeners a bit of a journey into understanding themselves. Right. So it blows my mind how all of this wraps together. But I just wanted to give that word of encouragement that I'm more effective in the world now, having been through this journey, than I ever was prior, when I really believed I was a personal identity and only a personal identity.
Right.
Right.
And, the way, again, it is a good word of encouragement. And I would add to that it's kind of like ripping a Band-Aid off, right? So it's like, do you want to face it now and start to really dig in now and unlayer oneself and see what's underneath? Or do you want to live, and have like it, because it's not always easy. It's difficult to really take a deep dive and with a scalpel, metaphorically speaking, and like pick out your beliefs, right, and question them, and essentially like discard them. But it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard for maybe a few years, 5-10 years,
Mm.
but then you're free,
Mm.
right? Or do you
Yeah.
want to be buried underneath them and have this always constant undercurrent of anxiety and fear and confusion for the rest of your life, right? So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
you
And
choose,
indeed,
right?
what I've found is, as my own journey progressed, I found that the practices that I was doing in themselves were the solution to the pain that was caused by doing the practices. That makes sense? So a lot of practitioners, that's a hard sentence to follow. A lot of practitioners experience this pain that you're talking about, this pain of ripping off that band-aid, re-examining ourselves and everything we've ever known. Oh my God, I'm causing myself so much trouble in the way that I'm thinking and being and feeling,
Right.
relating to people, relating to things. Wow, this really sucks.
Yeah.
Look how much trouble I'm causing myself, right? And now that I see it, I've got to clean it all up.
Yeah.
Right? That really is daunting. That's a great word for it,
Yeah.
brother. Daunting. I was very much daunted at many moments during that journey.
Yeah.
But what I found was the practice was always the answer. The teachings were always the answer.
Right.
So I remember having a really challenging time on the one and only hardcore meditation retreat I ever did. And there were many reasons why that was a difficult time. And indeed, they're meant to be a difficult time by design.
Right.
They're kind of the extreme version of that experiment that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
You really are on your own for 10 days
Yeah.
now, right?
Exactly.
Right.
And you chose it. You chose to.
Indeed. Yeah. So as you can imagine, I learned a lot about myself through that experience back in, I think that was 2017 there. And it forced me to reconsider whether I really wanted to continue with the practice. Because to me, that retreat had been presented by my first teacher as kind of the pinnacle of the practice that I was doing. But actually, there was a lot about that retreat setup which was lacking, which I found out actually after I reconnected with that teacher afterwards and told him about the experience. So I'm reconsidering, well, look, do I even want to continue with this? Yeah, okay, maybe certain things about this retreat were not ideal. But if that's the pinnacle of this path, do I really want to continue here? And what I found was I was just calling up that teacher of mine and having that conversation with him.
Right.
To get his angle on it. So I'm going to the source of that wisdom for advice on whether or not to continue pursuing that wisdom. So that kind of answered the question for me. Yes, I do think that this is the what shall I say, the way of reasoning things out, the way of being in the world that I wish to pursue. And I did. And then there were many teachers after that one. But that was an important realization.
Right.
Was that actually, even if I have bad experiences within this discipline, practice, teaching, I still wish to continue with it.
Right. Well, have you found also, like, I think an important point to make is like, once you start toying with this awareness, with this digging deep stuff, there comes a point I found where you can't go back. Like, too much.
Yep.
Like, it's like, okay, I'm going to start, I'm interested in God. I'm interested in source and finding out what I am. And you're sort of like, following it, like hiding out, like trying to like sneak up on it. And then eventually it's behind you and it's like chasing you.
Yeah.
You're like, shit, now I can't, I like have to, it's like, I better be prepared to see it through. Right. Cause I can't go back now. Especially with like, so I found where, once you start to become aware of these patterns, right, there's still a momentum to the mind around them, especially in the beginning. And it's like, I found myself in the past, and still to some degree today, there will be things like, I know better than this. Like, I know that this is
Mm.
not the direction I want to go, and I know it's ridiculous, and yet I can't help myself right now. I still am going to
Hmm.
play this pattern out, even though I see it
Hmm.
clearly that it's just silly, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
You remind me of a story Ram Dass told, that he'd booked a cabin in the woods somewhere to do a kind of self-led retreat,
Yeah.
and he'd planned everything, and he'd got the teachings that he wanted to read and the practices that he wanted to work on and develop, and total solitude, no one in sight, perfect conditions for a retreat. He said, all I did was sit in the bath and drink beer for 10 days.
Which, honestly, like you were talking about earlier, about how sometimes like life will use whatever is in its path to like wake you up, right? And sometimes maybe
Yeah.
that's what you need. You need this really harsh reminder that this isn't what it's about, and that will cause some
Yeah.
grand awakening experience.
Right.
Sitting in the bathtub
Right.
drinking beer for 10 days will get you to such a low
Mm-hmm.
state that you remember why you started doing this.
Indeed,
Yeah.
indeed, and it's interesting to consider. I mean, we'll never know, right? How much beer was he drinking, and can we be sure that there wasn't some practice going on in that? Right?
Right.
It's a form that we certainly wouldn't associate with spiritual practice, but that is itself spiritual materialism, right? We're putting a set of conditions upon what we do or don't call spiritual practice. Now, if we know Ram Dass, there was practice going on throughout that experience,
Yeah.
right? And it's a humorous story, and he's very kind in offering himself up as the brunt of that joke for us all, right?
For sure.
But my suspicion is, because this was fairly late in Ram Dass's life, my suspicion is that there was deep practice going on while
I,
he was there in the bath drinking his beer.
I would imagine. Yeah, he at least was aware of what he was doing right at
Mm.
that point in his life.
And watching himself from the outside, so to speak.
Right. Doing this quote
Oh
unquote
look,
ridiculous thing. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And hey, well, this will make a great story for the audience.
Right, exactly. Which
Yeah.
reminds me also, one of the things I love the most just about life in general, after going through this awakening process myself, is finding awake human beings, or finding beauty, finding God in the most inconspicuous places, in the most places you'd least
Yeah.
expect to find it. You don't really expect to find it in an ashram or in a but maybe you'll find it in a stripper at the strip club, or in the janitor at Walmart, right? Like,
Yeah.
like a
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
awake human
Yeah.
being. You're like, holy shit.
Yeah. 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 Well, indeed,
Yeah.
brother. I mean, this is one of my favorite things too, brother. That to meet undercover agents, as we might call them. People who have just come to these. Yeah. Because people do come to these conclusions entirely by themselves, having never read a Buddhist scripture, never even picked up the power of now.
Right.
Wouldn't even know who Eckhart Tolle was if you mentioned his name, and they've come to these same conclusions. Now, what's interesting is I've seen a pattern, which is actually that typically these people will have experienced some great hardship in their life,
Right.
right? That's forced them to look.
Yes, and it's not. So that brings me to my next. It's not. Nothing is spiritual. It's not spiritual. Spiritual is like a marketplace. It's a hook point. To get people in the door, right? Which it's useful. It can be useful, but like it's just truth. It's just seeing its utility more than anything. Like what works and what does not.
Right.
What's causing me pain
Right.
and what causes me freedom and harmony. Right. It's just the seeing, the looking. Right. And we've all met those people who are just something happened to them, or they're just open hearted. They're just open. Right. And they're just at ease naturally.
Yeah.
Great for those
to see,
people.
right?
It is.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And a great surprise, just to find someone who's come to these same conclusions.
Right.
That perhaps we've used something that's more typically associated with spirituality to get there.
I would.
Right. Where what this. Go ahead, brother.
I was just going to say, I would argue there is a slight difference though, because like I've
Okay.
heard it described as like there's kind of this was in the book Conversations with God, where with Neil
Yeah.
Donald Walsh, he talks about there's four different types of people spiritually. So there's
Mm,
people who don't understand and are totally caught in the mind, but they at least know that they don't know. They're confused and they're looking for help, right? And then there's
mm,
people who claim to know, but actually don't know, and they use that claim or that sort of charlatan aspect of themselves to control others. And then there's
mm,
people who know and know that they know, who are like awake, they've realized the self and they understand it, but they're not out spouting like in the sense of, oh, I know, I'm enlightened, whatever, but they understand
mm,
what they've come across. And then there's the people like we're talking about, I would think they would be the third category. They know but don't know that they know.
mm. Yeah.
Right? Like they don't
Yeah.
fully understand maybe what they've come across, like what they've
Right.
stumbled upon,
Right.
right? And that's where the
Right.
spiritual
Right.
like reference points can help to get them to that next
Yeah.
point
Yeah.
of like, oh, this is actually way more powerful than I imagined,
Right.
right? There's
Indeed, I imagine someone could just go through their life being described as a happy person.
right.
You know,
Right.
having realized this stuff and just never really having acknowledged the full power and benefit of it. And indeed, in the case that someone is just immersed in typical Western culture, they'd have no frame of reference to understand its power because no
Right.
one's looking for it.
Right.
No one's interested.
Right. They just
Now,
have this.
fortunately, of course, we're becoming more of a global culture.
Right. Yeah. Through things like this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. They would
Yeah.
just assume that, everybody, I'm just kind of like more relaxed than everybody else.
Yeah.
Things tend to work out
Yeah.
all right,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It reminds me of, have you ever seen the movie The Big Lebowski?
I have, but I don't remember it well.
Yeah. Well, that's like it. They apparently they watch in certain like Zen temples. They watch that movie because it's like an example of flow and like enlightenment. Because like he just everything rolls off his shoulders. He's just cool with whatever, and
Yeah.
like all this crazy shit happens in the movie, but like it just always works out
Yeah.
for him because he's just at ease all the time.
Maybe I'll go back to it.
Yeah, it's so good. Same with the movie Office
Yeah.
Space too, because he gets like hypnotized into like he hates his job, but then he gets hypnotized into this like relaxed, open state, and he just like stops going to work and gets promoted, and like all this like crazy shit happens. Dude, it's so good. Before
Brilliant.
I know we're pretty far in. Normally we do kind of the backstory at the beginning, but kind of maybe just give us a brief.
Mm,
I would just like to talk about kind of a pivotal moment for people.
mm,
I guess when they sort of went from, because you mentioned a little bit earlier of starting to see these truths and see, you're like, it's kind of daunting seeing that, oh, it's actually the backward step, the removal. So how did you get to that point? What were you doing before that led up to this
mm,
sort of these pivotal moments for you to get into what you're doing now?
mm. So I'd tried all kinds of practices. I'd sampled all kinds of teachings. And the one that stuck was a very modern and relatively lean presentation of Theravada Buddhism first, which was with a wonderful teacher named Dhammarato, who's out there on YouTube. He was actually sent out of his Theravada monastery to teach online. And we spent lots of time together. It was wonderful. At some point, he encouraged me to go and check out other teachings for points of reference. I'd expressed to him the confusion that came with having access to so many different teachings and how I wanted to cross-reference my understanding. He was already encouraging me to teach at this point. I had helped my mother over her suicide attempt, and I'd had some great early results with other family and friends just sharing what I'd learned. Dhammarato was encouraging me to teach more folks, strangers. I didn't quite feel ready, and the reason that I didn't feel ready was because I'd heard so many other presentations of wisdom. And this I came to understand as the unique predicament of the 21st century practitioner.
Mm.
where back along, not that long ago, typically people would have entered into one system, one tradition, one teaching,
Right.
and they would have just seen that through. These days, we're exposed to too much information to really be satisfied with that. We want to, in everything that we do, we tend to want to check out our options and
Right.
then settle on usually some synthesis of what we've found, right? So I'm checking out other teachings, greatly supported by the understanding that I've gained with this first teacher. And then I found a community that was meeting here in Bristol under a teacher who was then called Candice O'Denver. She's since taken a Tibetan name in her Vajrayana lineage and is now known as Ziji Rinpoche. Wonderful, wonderful teacher who is in a lineage of a Tibetan teaching called Dzogchen. This is their teaching of non-duality.
I've heard of it.
And so where we find presentations of non-duality in Zen, where we find presentations of non-duality in Advaita Vedanta under Hinduism, and there are even, I'm told, I've not explored these, but there are even some presentations of non-duality in Christian teachings. We're talking about I suppose, the Tibetan equivalent to that, although I might get taken down for suggesting such things.
It's okay.
It is the teaching of non-duality that, it is the teaching of non-duality that comes from Tibet.
Yeah.
And it struck me that, okay, well, there are teachings of non-duality in other cultures as well. They're never presented in quite the same way. And indeed, the Dzogchen tradition is incredibly rich. I would certainly not describe myself as a Dzogchen practitioner because there are certain specifics about that tradition which, if they are not upheld, then it's not Dzogchen that's being practiced. Mm-hmm. That said, what this teacher Ziji Rinpoche said about non-duality struck me deeply. And I realized in that moment that a lot of what I'd been doing in the Theravada presentation was indeed a doing. I was still trying to do something to change myself. Where the non-dual teachings from any culture are more about acceptance, relaxation, being with what is precisely as it is. Right. So I started to play with this. And as I played with it, I saw all of the ways in which I was still creating tension, still creating dissatisfaction. And slowly as I experimented with that, I came to my own realization of deep rest, acceptance, equanimity of everything that comes up.
Right. That's beautiful. So I guess in the Christian tradition, you could one could coin that as like surrender.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Surrendering to God's
Yeah, I'm
will.
interested actually. This is I see this being a potential direction for some reading for me actually, because I quite enjoy finding English words that at least sit alongside ideas, principles, teachings that come from the East.
I have had a few experiences.
Oh, you do?
I do.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I'll take those recommendations, brother, for sure. I had some experiences in church as a youngster, was completely turned off.
Yeah.
Assumed that there was nothing more there for me. And so went off and explored the teachings from the East. What's interesting about finding words or even entire teachings in English is that they begin in the English language, right? Or at least in a Latin-based language, because I think the Bible was originally written in Greek, if I'm correct.
I think so.
Yeah. So we're closer to home in our explanations in terms of how the language is being used, as opposed to having to translate from an Eastern language where the metaphysical assumptions are completely different as a starting point. right? I've found
Right.
incredible benefit in reading these translations of these Eastern teachings. But it's interesting to me now to draw these parallels to see, okay, well, what are there teachings out there that are as profound that began in a Latin-based language? And what can that tell us?
Exactly. So this brings up a point for me that I found super interesting. So like it's often thought of in the Christian tradition that sin and repentance means like I did bad, I'm a bad person, it's a moral thing. So
Mm.
I need to like beg for forgiveness, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
that's at least what a lot of people see it as, or what it's taught as, that stuff turned me off too as a kid, because I was like, that it goes with the original sin thing, right?
Yeah.
Whereas actually the Latin root word of sin means it means to miss the mark.
I'd
And
heard that from Alan
yeah,
Watts,
yeah, and to
Yeah,
repent just
yeah.
means to turn around. So it's not like it's
Interesting.
just the truth. It's utility. It's like, hey, you're going the wrong direction. It's causing suffering to you and others, so you might want to go a
Mm.
different direction. Like, it's not like you're a terrible
Yeah,
person. You're unredeemable. It's just like, hey, you're missing the mark a little here. It's hurt. It's causing pain. Right.
right, right, right. So this is not the first time that it struck me that maybe what we're really dealing with is just that the Christian teachings have been so misrepresented, so misinterpreted,
Mhm.
that that's where we've ended up having those awful experiences in church as youngsters and just being completely turned off of the whole thing.
Right, right. Because I mean, in the East, it's a little more, it's softer, right? In the East, it's just known
Yeah,
as like when somebody commits a terrible act, it's ignorance. They don't
yeah,
understand.
yeah,
And this is proven
yeah.
true by like even with Jesus's words, where he's like, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do."
Right,
Right. That's another way of
right.
expressing that. Right. He's like, when people were
Yeah, I don't
literally
know how
hanging
we
him
got
up.
from that to, yeah, I don't know how we got from that to Holy Crusades,
Right.
but
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly. Right. Or another way he put it was, because like in the East they talk about Maya. Maya is delusion. It's the
mm,
mind that
mm,
prevents us from seeing clearly, which is what is coined as enlightenment. Like in the Zen tradition, it's just seeing things the way they are. Whereas like
yeah,
Jesus would have put it as like heaven is spread amongst the earth, yet men do not see it. It's not somewhere
mm,
else, right? It's here now. And it reminds me of another saying. One of my favorites. I can't remember. It's one of my favorite sayings. I can't remember what Zen teacher said it, but I heard it in an Adyashanti talk where he is someone he had spoke of. But he said, "A single thought believed sets apart heaven and hell."
yeah,
Right?
yeah,
Single thought,
yeah,
and
yeah.
that was really poignant to me.
Yes, I suspect that is an alternate translation of a line from a text of which I'm very fond, which was written by, I think, the third patriarch of Chan Buddhism, right, which was what Zen was before it made its way to Japan.
Mm-hmm.
The text is called Sin Sin Ming, which roughly translates to verses on faith mind. And I think I heard an alternate translation of the line that you just spoke beautifully. They're both beautiful translations, and that text as a whole is mind blowing. That was one text actually that blew me wide open. That was an early encounter with non-dual teaching, and I read that text dozens and dozens of times. It's not a long text. I remember a walk I took. I was teaching drums at the time, had a gap between students, and all I was ever thinking of at that time was practice and going deeper into these teachings. And I read that text. It was one of my earlier readings, and I just went out for a walk, and everything seemed very, very different to how I normally perceived it.
Yeah.
Very different indeed.
Have you? I would love to. You have to remind me of the name of that because I would love to read it. Because
Mm.
dude, I love this. Is one of my favorite things to do is take Western teachers and poets and artists and avatars and um, find the similarities and the coinciding aspects to the Eastern thought and Eastern ways
Mm.
of teaching. It's just puts such a unique spin on it. It's it definitely has its ways of opening us up in different ways. Like
Yeah.
sometimes you could hear the same teaching 100 different times, 100 different ways, but it's that 101st time that like cracks you wide open, right?
Yeah.
Then it sticks, right? And I've been reading. I don't know if you've ever read any of Walt Whitman's poetry
No.
at all.
No.
There's one called "Song of the Open Road" where he has a way of describing just like a unified vision that
Mm.
is beautiful. Where he talks about just essentially stepping forth and losing him or removing himself of all limits, becoming his own master and walking the open road. And yet in the next sentence he'll speak of like hanging out with the common folk, listening to what they say, contemplating it, like taking it in, right? So this like duality, this paradox, how he beautifully puts it together is it's incredible. Yeah. So highly recommend him. He's a very awake poet of the West.
I've written his name down. I am familiar with the name, but never read any of his work, so I've got a note here. I will chase you up for those book recommendations as well.
Yeah, for sure. So we're coming up on an hour here. Is there anything, any other topics you'd like to touch on?
No, brother, I'm happy. I think maybe we would do well to talk about the transition in my life to the online space.
Yes. Let's talk about that.
And just how these practices kind of informed that, right? Was that something that you wanted to know?
Correct. Yeah, I'd like to. That transition of what you're doing now and how it's kind of all integrated, and that's kind of the name of the podcast, how it's culminated into where you're at now.
Ah,
right.
I love it. Love a good,
yeah.
Love a good play on words that doesn't make you cringe. You've actually managed it, brother, which is quite a feat.
I appreciate it. Yeah, I love it, man. Yeah.
Me too, man. Me too. It's right there in the name, right? Yeah. You were dealt a good hand there, brother.
I was, yeah. Just sort of, my buddy brought it up one day. He's like, "You should call your podcast The Culmination Project." I was like, "All right,
nailed it."
Yeah, so
nailed it. So, following on from my encounter with Ziji Rinpoche's teaching, and that really finally blew me wide open to where there was just nothing left to seek following understanding of that teaching. Indeed, I found that then in not too long, I was able to rest naturally without seeking or describing anything in all circumstances. And of course, along with that came the end to seeking to be any different in this manifestation of a human being, but also a cessation of seeking any further teachings. So I really felt done at that point, satisfied, which is just delightful. I mean, I feel so fortunate to have encountered these teachings and teachers.
Real quick, would you say now it's kind of switched from you're like seeking teachings in order to inform, and now like the teachings you read, you're just more interested in them? It kind of sounds like they're just more for
absolutely
just for pure joy, right?
Yeah. Indeed, joy, a celebration of the teaching, more different ways to explain things.
Right.
We get great stories from these teachings, right? And one thing actually that I've been reading up on just recently to inform my practice as a teacher is that in the Tibetan tradition, the Vajrayana tradition, they are incredibly comprehensive. They include all of the Theravada and the Mahayana within the Vajrayana, which is the Tibetan system of Buddhism. And there are various schools within the Vajrayana even. So as always, we've got sects and subsects, and there's all different interpretations of how things are done. But one of the things that's really interesting about the Vajrayana as a whole is they will prescribe various teachings and practices to practitioners according to their level of understanding. So we're kind of back to, and as I read about this, I became aware of how I'd kind of intuitively found my way to something like that as I was working with my own students. In the case that sitting full lotus in a meditation hall for 10 hours a day is what someone needs, then that's what we should prescribe, right? The skill then comes in knowing when it's the appropriate moment to prescribe. And so I went and did some reading. There's not any great clear accounts of how these teachers would make their prescriptions. The reason being it's all highly personal. Depends upon the relationship between the teacher and the student. The teacher is often looking for intangible things in the student that gives them their cues as to what to prescribe. And as I read about this, I became more and more confident that, well, this is precisely what I've been doing.
Yeah.
But it was interesting nonetheless to do some reading there. So this is the kind of reading that I'm doing these days.
So it naturally happened for you.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And I believe this is what will happen for anyone who takes their own practice to such a degree that all practitioners experience that as their understanding of themselves deepens, they understand other people better as well.
Yes.
To the point it almost becomes like mind reading. Even Debbie, my wife, who knows me better than anyone, and is present when I'm having conversations with students a lot of the time and whatnot, she still will be surprised at moments of intuition in which I just know what she's thinking. And it's not anything magical. It's just that we become so quiet and our understanding of the mechanics of the mind and the feelings become so complete that it's just obvious a lot of the time.
Right.
What someone's thinking, what someone's feeling, and I really, where I first began to notice this was in my previous work as a drum teacher. Just became very clear to me what clients, students, and their parents were thinking. I taught a lot of youngsters. I started to witness a lot of the dynamics between the parents and the kids, which previously I had been blind to. And I was rarely so bold as to make any explicit statements about any of this. It was just interesting to witness. And actually, Debbie coming into my life with her academic background as a neuropsychologist, she did a great deal to confirm for me the process that I had been through and the understanding and wisdom that I'd gained. Because so much of it matched up, great teacher named Alan Wallace claims that the Buddha was really a scientist.
Yeah.
And that they didn't have instrumentation, but he actually coined the term contemplative science.
Yeah.
Which is rather nice. I quite like that.
Right.
And it was clear as day to me, the parallels between a lot of what Debbie has studied as a neuropsychologist and a lot of what I've studied doing this contemplative science.
Right. It can bring a structure, right? Like it can bring a reference
it's
point.
Also a reference and indeed it's the coming together of the contemplative science with the measured science. And when the instrumentation reports the same thing as the contemplation does, now you're really cooking. You've got two very distinct data points,
right?
Which can confirm one another.
Right. It kind of shows.
So this was,
pathway of sorts.
Yeah. So part of the struggle in my journey, brother, was precisely that I hadn't entered into a single tradition where there are systems in place and thousands of years of evidence an experience whereby the practitioner is led through a system, and then at each step in that system, there are checks and there are confirmations
Right.
of what the practitioner has been doing, their practice, their depth of realization, etc. Well, we just don't have that as 21st century practitioners, because we're just not going to shave our heads and divorce our families and run off into the forest. It's just
Right.
so far removed from our culture, right?
Right.
And so we're left with, really, we have to self-diagnose, or we can kind of triangulate our position based on feedback from various sources, readings, teachings that we hear, etc., one another. These kinds of relationships with peers are super beneficial, and always have been in my journey, and we can confirm one another by our own experiences.
Right. Point I
And
want.
so
Go ahead.
go ahead
I was
go
say
ahead
a point I wanted to make about that is like I actually can see how there might be some sort of a detriment to, or there could be some sort of a detriment to following one path, right? From
100%.
getting fixated on the path versus like if you look at the Buddha, you look at Jesus, or any of the great realizers, eventually like they kind of tried everything, right? And then
Yeah,
eventually they found
yeah,
their own way. That's what like was their
yeah.
final enlightenment, was proving things true or false for themselves,
Right,
you know?
right.
So,
Absent of the comfort of having someone else tell them,
right.
okay, you've done it now.
Right, right,
So we all have to step into that confidence ourselves,
right,
right? There's something more sinister about entering into one system, which is that you're always at the mercy of whomever is the wisest being in that club,
right, right. Which
right?
it reminds me of another. It's like if you meet the Buddha on the side of the road, kill him. Have you ever heard that one?
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah,
like if you get fixated on the wisest person, or you're like, oh, this is my new god, right? That means you need to go further.
yeah,
That
yeah,
means
yeah,
you're stuck in
yeah,
a cul-de-sac, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so by means of, triangulating my position by means of all of these various teachings, and then Debbie was really the final piece of the puzzle, in as much as she was able to say from an academic standpoint,
Hmm.
yeah, this is crazy, actually. And I'd been so immersed in these teachings for so long, and I'd said goodbye to many friends along this journey. And so I was really quite solitary and quite immersed in my own practice. And so then when Debbie came on the scene, she was like, wow, this is what you've managed to do here is incredible. You're never angry, you're never impatient, you're never whatever. This is amazing by an academic standard too. So it became clear to me at some point, brother, and I'm finally getting around to the transition that I made in terms of lifestyle now. I'd had this encouragement from my first teacher. I'd had encouragement from another teacher as well to go ahead and teach. It became clear to me at some point that to hesitate any further was actually to the detriment of my fellow human being.
Right. Right.
Right. So as much as I felt the weight of the responsibility that is on one's shoulders who teaches this stuff, because people really do come to us in very vulnerable states. And indeed, for me at least, I give a disclaimer with all of my teachings that this is not a treatment. I'm not a therapist of any kind, that this is educational. But nonetheless, people come to us for help.
Right.
And the help that they're seeking is they're examining themselves very deeply, and there's often a lot of vulnerability. And so I really felt the weight of that responsibility. As I said, I helped my mother through a suicide attempt. I helped my cousin come off antidepressants, and these were the kinds of to see strangers who were having similarly deep troubles was really something that I wanted to be very careful about. But as I say, at some point it became clear to me, okay, I'm withholding value at this point. And so I'd already been teaching for some time. I was still teaching drums, and that was a full-time job that was taking up a lot of time. I started to have experiences like my phone would be buzzing in my pocket whilst I was giving a drum lesson. And I knew it was a mindfulness student because they told me they were going to call, but I couldn't answer because I'm giving a drum lesson. And the drum lesson that I'm giving was very often the same lesson that I'd given to that same individual 12, 13, 14 times in a row. Because for better or worse, music, as wonderful as it is a hobby for most people. It's a hobby. And hobbies are great, but they're not life-changing in most circumstances. And so there were two things that I could have been doing with that moment. Helping this individual who was calling me up with some deep insight they'd had in meditation, a breakup, a panic attack, they took too many mushrooms, really, really
something life altering.
Yeah. And so I'm like, well, there's two things I could be doing with this moment. And so that was the beginning of the transition. I started to look for ways that I could create a business around this. And this was a big struggle for me as well, brother. This was a point over which I really deliberated for a long time. That first teacher of mine, who was really my primary teacher, the teacher that I spent most time with, he forbade any involvement of money in the transmission of these teachings. As any good Theravadan would, that's just how the Theravada does things.
Yeah, that's their tradition.
And so so I really had to reconcile that. And what got me through that conundrum in the end was just deciding that mutual benefit was my compass. Right. And that I might have to upset that first teacher of mine in order to be of most benefit to humanity.
Well, and again, that's coming back to your own truth, right? Not some prescribed way of being, right?
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. So I went ahead, got online, started that X account, which is where we met. And then shortly after you and I met Dan Coe, who has been a great mentor to me, launched a cohort course in April of last year that earned me enough money to close my drum teaching business, and the rest is history.
Nice. That's so awesome. I love that.
Great, right?
I love that. Yeah, that's so cool. That just goes to show people, when that calling comes online, the more we step into it, the more life sort of gets out of our way, in essence, and just things fall naturally into place, which is the whole overarching theme of what we're talking about. The relaxation and the trust and the faith and the knowing that I don't have to have it all figured out. I just have to take the next step. Right?
Yes, brother.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I've kind of found, I've almost found sort of not complete opposite way of being, but like I'm in the real estate field, so I'm good at it. It's something that is a great investment. I make good money at it, and I genuinely enjoy doing it. And I love this though too. I love having these conversations. I love writing. I love coaching. And I did coaching for about 6 months last year, and I had five different clients, and was getting paid pretty well to do it. But it almost felt kind of, for me, it felt at the time kind of forced, because I was like, okay, now I have to go out and like make this money and do this, and right. Whereas for you, it sounds like it was more of a smoother transition, and maybe not totally smooth, but it was something you were more like called to do. Whereas for me, it was more of like this idea. It was still the mind coming in and being like, oh, now I have to go make money at this.
Right.
Right. So I've chosen to kind of do this path of, I make enough money to support myself with the real estate stuff, and it's not super time consuming. It's, and I enjoy it. And then I have plenty of time to do this, right?
Yeah.
This sort of stuff too.
Wonderful.
And maybe the transition will happen more, towards the other way.
Maybe it will, and look, maybe it won't. I mean, there's great dharma in helping people find a home.
Right. Well, and I just don't I'm at the point where I just don't really care that much Like
Yeah.
I'm just cool with just being and waking up every morning and loving my routine and
Yeah.
enjoying making the phone calls for real estate and then having some of these conversations and doing some writing. It's just like that's the whole point, right? There's
Yeah.
it's you create this perspective, or you rather remove all the things that are in the way of the perspective of just being here and
Yeah.
enjoying the whatever's arising.
Yeah. You got it, brother. You got it. You got
Yeah,
it.
man.
And that actually wraps things up nicely, because that's precisely the reality that I'm in as I go about everything that I'm doing here. You know, I wake up with that very natural wish, that aspiration for mutual benefit, and
Right.
then everything else just kind of happens.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, then this is why I love talking about this stuff, because I want others to know what this feels like and what this
Yeah.
experience is like to actually be okay with who and where and whatever you're doing,
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
even
you're
the
doing a great
mundane.
service out here, brother.
Right. Cool, man. Well, it's been really amazing talking to you. And for our listeners here, where can people find you, whether it's your website or your newsletter
Sure.
or Twitter?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I'm at dangoldfield.com, where people can sign up for newsletter. I'm most active on X, on Twitter, at It's Dan Goldfield, but I'm also out on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube as well.
Awesome, brother. Well, it's so good having you on. I appreciate you so much. And I'll send you those book recommendations, and please send me any of yours that you have as well.
Please do, brother. Delightful chatting with you, man. So great to hang.
Likewise. You have a great evening, brother.
You too.